Hey everybody, and welcome back to the next part in my guitar solo analysis series of videos. And this time I'm going to take a deeper look into Marty Friedman's amazing guitar solo on the Megadeth song Symphony of Destruction. This is one of the more recent guitar solo cover videos I did, and I had a couple of requests to kind of take a deeper dive into it and analyze it and kind of show what's going on in it. So we're going to do just that. So let's dive right in without further ado and take a look at what some of the magic that Marty created in this solo. So first things first, though, what I want to do is sort of lay out the harmonic structure of this song. There's kind of some interesting stuff going on. What Marty does in this tune, well, actually, I shouldn't say what Marty does, what the band does, what Megadeth does. If we examine the rhythm guitar part, which I'm assuming is played by Dave Mustaine, but who knows, right? Basically, this is just a recurring theme that keeps going over and over again throughout the however many bars of soloing he does here. 16 bars or whatever it is. So this is the main riff that he does. He goes. What's strange about that is if we actually just think of that as being the harmonic structure, it doesn't give us the whole picture. What he's basically doing is inverted power chords. Is an A power chord, A flat power chord working down sort of chromatically to a G power chord, but he's not doing the root note, he's just doing the inversion of it. So he has the fifth on the bottom, right? So here, there's your A power chord, A flat, G, and always kind of putting this E kind of chugging pedal tone in between. Now that really doesn't give the whole picture, and it seems almost a little bit ambiguous. It seems to create this E tonal center, right, with this kind of oddball A flat in there almost for tension, but that's more of a passing chord. I don't really think that's creating a lot of the harmonic structure of it. What we have to do is look to the bass guitar to see what's actually happening. And when you look at that, what ends up happening is the bass guitar is playing basically 2 bars on E, 2 bars on G, 2 bars on C, and 2 bars on A, which when you break that down into actual guitar chords and the chords that are being implied, what we have is an E minor for 2 bars, G major for 2 bars, C major for 2 bars, and an A minor for 2 bars. Very diatonic to the key of E minor / G major, however you want to look at it. So right away we realize that the solo can probably just be handled by playing, some sort of an E minor scale over top of it, and it's probably going to work really well with all those chords because they're all diatonic to the key. Diatonic meaning from the actual key, right? So what I've done with the tab here is I've written in where the chord changes are. You see here, E minor for 2 bars, G for 2 bars, C for 2 bars, A minor for 2 bars. So we can really analyze what Marty's doing over top of that. And, we obviously know that the rhythm is not somebody just sitting there strumming, away to these chords, right? So it's a combination of this riff and what the bass guitar is doing is implying those chords. So let's dive into the first chord change. What Marty does seems at first glance to just kind of be focusing on that E tonal center, right? What happens interesting there in my mind, though, is if we think of a normal E minor scale or G major scale, we would actually have the note C in an actual E minor scale. But what he touches on here, and this is the beauty of what Marty does in a lot of his solos, he goes below notes and then bends into them with maybe sometimes not so obvious notes, right? So for instance, here, fine E to a D, which is part of the E minor scale, B, which is a chord tone of the E minor chord. What he starts off here, he lands on a C sharp. Now, that's not part of E minor. Okay, that would actually be implying E Dorian. Okay, so more of like a B minor scale, let's call it, right? So basically, again, if we take our E minor scale, which already has an F sharp in it, and change the C note to a C sharp, we we have E Dorian, okay? So that stems from a D major scale or B minor scale. So what he does is sort of right away implies on that E minor chord that he's going to focus a little bit on Dorian. So you get... But he doesn't spend a long time there is the thing. He kind of takes that note and slowly bends it up to a D note. But he still was there long enough that he implied that E Dorian sound. So that's pretty interesting. The chord changes to G, and what's neat about it, right when he bends up to the D, is where the chord changes to G, which the note D that he bends up to is implied, is a chord tone in the G chord, right? Now, he does something neat here again with this sort of going below a note and then bending up to it. He goes to a B flat here on the 3rd fret while he's on the G chord and bends into a B note, which again is a chord tone in G, right? The notes of a G major chord are G, B, and D. So he goes... Yeah, actually, before he gets to the 3rd fret, he bends the 7th fret D up to an E, which is fine. That's still diatonic. So he gets down to this B flat note, which actually would turn that G major chord into a minor chord. So it almost is a note that kind of clashes in a sense, but he doesn't spend long enough there before he kind of bends it right back into a chord tone of B, which is a really kind of gives it that exotic flavor to it, right? So that whole thing, really interesting the way he milks those notes. So far, right? Before the chord now changes to a C major. Again, a very interesting thing here now. He does these little half-step bends again. He starts on the note A here at the 2nd fret on the 3rd string, but he bends up to a B flat note. Now, the B flat, again, really goes outside of our normal E minor or E Dorian. This is a totally new note. And what it kind of sort of implies here is a sort of a subtle nod to C mixolydian, which would be stemming from an F major scale, right, which would be flat. So it creates the impression of not just a C major chord, but a C 7th chord. Otherwise, it looks like we're kind of just within an E minor pentatonic, which kind of work with the overall tonality of this piece. So kind of interesting what he does with that C. Turns it into almost a C 7th feel, a mixolydian. And he does it again, where he starts what we see here with the half-step pre-bend, right? So, but it's all very subtle, right? He's not spending a lot of time there. He's just implying these things. Really interesting stuff. So far then... Nothing too over-the-top crazy like we would expect from Marty Friedman, but this is where it starts to get interesting. So we look at this next run, and these are the kind of runs that Marty does that tends to cause people to kind of scratch their head a little bit until we analyze it. So we're now moving into an A minor chord, okay? This run requires some coffee. Now, at first glance, you take this run slowly. Okay, well, what I do here is I look for patterns that I recognize. And what I see here is, because it's being played over an A minor chord, I start looking for, is he maybe playing around an arpeggio? And he is doing exactly that, right? If we start here on C, that's a chord tone of A minor. Anybody who's played arpeggio patterns, maybe some sweeps, right, will recognize this little pattern. Right, as an A minor arpeggio. Well, because he's playing over this A minor chord, what he does is he takes basically the A minor arpeggio but adds an F sharp note to it. So basically adding a 6th interval or a 13th, whatever you want to think of it as. So he kind of creates an A minor 6th arpeggio here. And so C C, E, there's your sixth, back into our normal arpeggio, back to a sixth again, back to a sixth again. I'm sorry. We don't want to go to C sharp there. That would be awful because that's not a chord tone. So something along those lines. So basically outlining an A minor arpeggio in places and throwing in these F sharp notes. Okay? So if we learn these patterns and then know where those F sharp notes in, we're going to be able to do these runs a little bit easier. And that's what allows me a lot of times to learn these. I didn't spend more than about 15 minutes learning this solo. And one of the reasons is, as you're going to see in a couple of the next sections, is once you recognize where the patterns are coming from that Marty's using, you can kind of reach into your own memory bank of patterns you've practiced in the past and have a very quick way of recalling them. And because your fingers are used to playing them, it's not going to be as challenging either. So that's what happens with that A minor. Now, he goes back and he starts cycling the chords over again. We're back to an E minor chord. And he does what some people might find intimidating lick here, but it's very, very repetitive now. He touches back here, which is pretty interesting, back to the E Dorian mode. And here's the little riff that he does. Sorry. Now you might say, well, what makes that Dorian? Well, every note in here is B, A, G, A, B, A, G, A, D, A, G, D, A, G. These are all diatonic to the key of E minor until he gets to this note here, which is that C sharp again, which comes from D major or B minor, right? But in this case, we would refer to as E Dorian because we're playing over top of the E minor scale. So he does this basically recurring pattern that kind of plays with time a little bit. The accents are neat here. He accents on the one of each group of four. These are 16th notes. So he accent 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. So it's almost, that's where the accents lie, right? He accents here where you would expect it to be. He accents here, but then the accent is on kind of the or the final 16th note of beat 3, right? And then on the and of the final beat 4. So that's what gives this its sound. And kind of kicks the time around a bit, right? It's kind of a cool lick. But the nice thing is, what I would do with that is if that was a problem area, I would just do what I just did there and just keep looping that one. Until it feels comfortable, you know. So that's a Dorian lick again, which is really, the interesting thing about him doing the Dorian there is, if we analyze the rest of the chord progression, the C major chord, the A minor chord, both contain the note C in it, right? So for him to all of a sudden go back in just over the E minor chord and go and touch on the C sharp gives it that outside sound that Marty is a lot of times known for, and that's where that tonality is coming from. So very interesting stuff to dive into. So for the second bar of the E minor, he does something really neat. He just takes this same pattern and realizes that if he moves it from going on the second and third strings and just moves it up a string, all those notes still fall within his scale that he needs. So he just takes that, takes the sort of the familiarity of this sort of odd rhythmic feel that he's created, moves it up a couple strings, and he's good as gold. Now, the great thing for us as players is we don't have to learn anything new. We just got to move it down a string. So if we've already practiced going, we just move up 2 strings, then practice them together. And you're as good as gold. And that's a very structured thing. I mean, that's the type of thing Marty would likely play the same way every time, just because it's so carved in stone, right? And again, that's not really outside of anything outside of the E minor scale. Although we would probably tend to think of it as E Dorian still as a continuation because he's put that sound of that C sharp in our ear over the E minor chord previous, right? So there he implied Dorian. Even though he doesn't imply it again, it's kind of stuck in our ear until the G major chord comes around. So the cool little riff, really awesome stuff. This one I really liked, and this is one that could confuse a lot of people when we first look at it. We see him kind of do this crazy. Okay, so what he does there is really kind of neat. If we break this into pieces, it's really easy to digest. He's basically outlining a G major arpeggio all the way down the neck, leading up to this final bend. Okay, so if these are patterns we've seen before, let's take a look. I don't know if a lot of you will recognize this one. Just a G major sweeping arpeggio, where I'm going 10th fret, 14th fret, barring with my second finger across the 12th fret here, up to the 10th fret at the first string. So if you're used to that, what you realize he's doing here is he's just borrowing the top portion of that. Which is going to work great over our G major chord. He then moves that up to here. So anybody who's used to those sort of sweeping arpeggios, right? That's going to be an important one for the rest of this. So he's just borrowing the top portion of that. So he goes, so a little, I do it with a pull off, moves up to yet another G major arpeggio. So he basically does just sort of climbing up a G major set of arpeggios, right? Different inversions of it. Okay, moves down to the next string. Guess what? Another G major arpeggio. Moves to the third string. Guess what? Another G major arpeggio. And these ones are all from so he starts here, right? Moves down a string and just sort of descends down them. And then he does this little scale run before he bends up to a B note, which is part of our G major chord again. So almost, something like that. But you get the idea. So once we understand this and break it into little groups of 4 here, we see that each one of these are just little arpeggio shapes based off of our G major arpeggio, which makes perfect sense because he's playing over top of the G major chord. All right, he switches back to another C. Now, what it looks like here is he kind of now just dives back in to more of like E minor pentatonic scale, which is going to work fine over that C major chord, right? That's diatonic to that key, so we could do that. But he's adding in a very special note. He's actually taking it more like what the blues scale would be. Right? But over top of this C. So what happens when we add that B flat note in from our E minor blues scale or E blues scale? What happens is that creates that same almost touching on the mixolydian sound, that C7th chord. Okay, when we add the B flat note, which is right there, to the C, it creates that C7th, which he's kind of touching on like he did before up here when we were talking about where he created that C7th tonality. So he keeps going back to it. If you notice, on the E minor chord, he goes back and touches on Dorian all the time by adding the C sharp in. But when he goes to the C, oftentimes he's going and he's adding in some form of the B flat note, which is really interesting that he keeps these sort of themes going. So a little bit touch on C mixolydian, touch on E Dorian, gives it a real kind of nice outside sound. And that's where I think a lot of the brilliance of the solo line. So what's the riff here? Well, he kind of goes between Okay, the reason I say it's not just Mixolydian, and we can't just say that, is because he's also throwing the B note in, right? So it's kind of almost a chromatic feel to it. Right? Is that B flat, B, C, right? But the way I kind of figured out the fingering for what worked for me, I don't know if Marty plays it like this, but, sorry. Which is what's up on the. Okay, that type of an idea. So, but over that C major, it gives that Mixolydian or C7th chord feel to it. So really interesting. Like, and again, just slowing this down and getting a feel for it is important. He finally ends it off with another A minor chord, which is kind of neat because his final thing is to bend up to an A note from G. And he does a very typical pentatonic blues lick, but kind of fiercely and aggressively, where he goes. Right? So it's just your typical kind of. Always this. But ending with a bend here once, ending here with a bend once. So one time bending from D up to E, and one time bending from A up to B, right? And then finally closing it off with kind of a double stop bend between both of those notes. Kind of aggressively bending. I don't know if it's really a full step bend or not really. It's kind of more just really digging into it in some vibrato. So pretty interesting stuff. So really what the takeaway is, he has kind of a diatonic chord progression in E minor, right? Just going E minor, G, C, A minor. When he's on the E minor, oftentimes touching on that E Dorian tonality, right? When he's playing over the G, oftentimes just these arpeggio patterns. Right, and when he's touching on the C, oftentimes throwing that B flat note in to create a Mixolydian, touching on the Mixolydian, not really pure Mixolydian, or just creating that C7th chord tonality, right, as he does in that last. Right, so lots of fun within that solo, so. I hope I covered everything. I hope I didn't miss anything. And I hope that helped you guys to kind of appreciate what Marty's doing in here. I haven't played that solo in a while. Sorry for a couple of the sloppy little parts on the plan. If you want to see the performance I did of that solo, please check out the link in the description below. I did that a couple weeks back, but it turned out pretty neat. Just use the backing track online. So the rhythm guitar you're hearing there is not the Helix. The tone I used was one of my Brit 2204 patches. This one that you're hearing today is the Brit 2204, not the Brit 2204, sorry, the 2204 mod distortion snapshot that I put out a couple weeks ago in a Dialing In series. So anyways, guys, thank you so much for tuning in. I really appreciate you guys sticking with me. I hope that was a solo that was of interest to you guys, and there was a few interesting things we could learn from that. Definitely a fun one. Take it slow. There's a couple tricky parts in there, but definitely a solo worth learning. And there's lots we can take away from that, even from the theory side of things. Never mind just the technical side of things. Marty's just such a monster player, right? And always been a huge fan of his. So thanks again, guys, for tuning in. Please like the video, share it if you don't mind. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And I'll be back with a lot more content in the near future. Thank you again so much for tuning in, and we'll talk soon.